in. Well, changing to the main subject. Thank you very much. So, yes, it's the economy is now and seems like a little bit take off, hopefully. And so we have a very nice, timely presentation from Wall Street Journal. Mr. Jacob Schlesinger, senior Asia economics correspondent. Mr. Schlesinger has has lived in Tokyo 10 years, more than that. And then previously, he is the Tokyo bureau chief and graduate from Harvard in economics and a member of journal team winning the 2013 Pulitzer Prize. 2003.
Sorry, long time ago.
That's that was wonderful. Jacob, thank you for your time, please.
Well, thank you, Sugihara-san, and thank you all for making it out here on this lovely spring morning so early. In anticipation that whatever I have to say may not have been sufficient to justify your attendance, we've also made sure to pass out copies of today's Wall Street Journal gratis. Make sure that you get one. And also, on the remote chance that not every single one of you has been a longtime loyal subscriber like Tad Johnson over there, we have also material on how to subscribe. Included with that is a card that gives you a 4-week free online subscription, trial subscription. So, and if you are a subscriber, please make sure to spread the word and get it to somebody who may not already have that privilege. And I should say also, while I'm here to talk about the economy, I want to leave lots of time for questions and answers and discussion. And in addition to discussion on the main topic, I'd be happy to talk about the journal and journalism. I know, talking to Tad earlier, that there's often a lot of interest in those subjects as well. So whatever you want to talk about is free and fair game. And on the economy itself, I'm a little humbled to be talking to this group. I know a lot of you, some in person, some by reputation, and in a lot of ways, you're much more intimately familiar with how things are progressing than I myself in my observer's chair. And so what I'm going to try and do is frame what I think are kind of the big questions, and I'd be eager to get your perspective on which direction you think things are going. My topic was to talk about the state of play of Abenomics, a kind of report card 2.5 months in. And I'd like to start by looking essentially through the prism of the news from last Friday, which I think encapsulates well a lot of the current state of play and the questions and tensions. On Friday, you may be aware, the Nikkei stock average rose for the 11th straight day. That was the first time that had happened since the bubble glory days of 1988. And just a week earlier, another bubble-era market milestone had been toppled. The Nikkei itself, as I'm sure you all know, even with its recent bull run to about 20,000, is still far below its peak of 39,000. But a couple weeks ago, the market capitalization of the Tokyo Stock Exchange first section set a new record. It wasn't as widely noticed, but it was also a significant benchmark. It hit 591 trillion yen for the first time, passing the 590.9 trillion yen value that it had hit in December of 1989. And yet, while the stock market, as everyone knows, is doing quite well, the real economy still seems to have some trouble showing that it can shake off the surprisingly debilitating impact of the sales tax increase from just over a year ago, and is still having trouble showing that it is conclusively finally gaining sustainable momentum. Also on Friday, there was a considerable amount of economic data that was released. And while investors were bidding up stocks, the government reported that household spending, to the surprise of almost all forecasters, fell in April from a year earlier. Now, remember that April 2014 was when purchases had plunged right after the April 1st implementation of the tax hike. That, of course, was expected. But the fact that a year later consumer spending was still falling from even that very low base was unnerving and suggesting that Japanese consumers remain quite wary. In what seemed like good news announcement Friday, the government issued a separate report on the labor market, showing that it was tightening as unemployment fell to a remarkable 3.3%, the lowest level in 18 years. But that was actually not so much the result of robust hiring by optimistic companies, but rather the fact that people were leaving the labor force. The number of people with jobs in Japan in April was actually down 280,000 from the previous month. The only reason the jobless rate fell was because the number of people in the labor force fell by even more, by 340,000. And for all the focus on pushing companies to boost pay for workers, wage gains have remained tepid. Real disposable income was reported Friday to have risen just 0.1% in April. And now any of you who are paying even modest attention to Abenomics and Japan's economy know that there was a huge amount of energy and focus on the Shunto, the annual spring labor negotiations in April. That's because many economists and policymakers say the biggest test of whether this recovery is for real is whether workers get decent wages. We won't know the full results of this year's Shunto and the economy-wide wage patterns until the end of July, but the numbers so far point to just a slight uptick from the gains of last year, and still likely well below the union demands and the expectations and hopes of policymakers. Meantime, data from last Friday also showed that the progress that had been made over the past 2 years toward ending deflation and stoking inflation had evaporated in April. Recall that the boldest and most clear goal set at the outset of Abenomics by Prime Minister Abe and his Bank of Japan governor, Haruhiko Kuroda, was to end that debilitating vicious cycle of falling prices, wages, spending, and investment that had weakened Japan for over the past 15 years, and to create 2% inflation within 2 years. Well, April was the second anniversary of that pledge, and far from hitting that goal, the Consumer Price Index for April was reported Friday to be 0, with many analysts expecting it to slip back into negative territory in the coming months. Now, Kuroda says that's a temporary setback, the result of plunging oil prices that are outside his control, and he remains confident he'll hit his inflation target fairly soon, albeit on a somewhat delayed timetable. But many private economists, and indeed many members of Mr. Kuroda's own policy board, are skeptical of success. The ongoing uncertainty about the vigor of the economy has left it unclear if real price pressures are actually building up enough, even after adjusting for the impact of oil. So let me step back to where I started and summarize it all this way. There's a gap, that gap between the bullish stock market performance and investor optimism, and the continued uncertainty about the health of Japan's underlying economy is the key paradox of Abenomics right now. And the big question is this just a time lag? That is the market performing what is its normal function of foreshadowing a robust recovery, albeit with some delay? Or is there some kind of breakdown in Japan between the market performance and the economic performance? There are two main arguments behind the view that there is a disconnect, that the bull market is not signaling a broader economic recovery for Japan. The first is the belief that stocks have been steered as much by the visible hand of policymakers as by the invisible hand of the free market. Over the past few months, one of the largest buyers of Japanese equities has been the Bank of Japan, the world's only major central bank to buy stocks as well as bonds as part of its quantitative easing stimulus program. There's also been a huge rush of money into the stock market from the government investment fund, and likely soon more from Japan Post, an institution that the government still holds a large ownership stake in. The impact of those bureaucrat-driven stock purchases has been amplified, at least temporarily, by foreign investors who are openly saying that they're motivated by a desire to cash in on that wave as much as by any real belief in the Japan recovery story. It's a 21st century version of the 1990s PKO, for those of you who have been around long enough to remember that, the finance ministry's price-keeping operation that briefly helped prop up Japanese stocks after the bubble burst. A second main argument supporting the notion of a disconnect between the market and the economy is that Japan's economy has fundamentally changed during the lost decades, and that the normal response mechanisms to policy and market stimulus simply aren't working anymore, due to both psychology, the so-called deflationary mindset, and the actual machinery of how companies function. To elaborate and to oversimplify a little bit, the single biggest part of Abenomics to date has been the radical Bank of Japan stimulus. The single biggest impact of BOJ stimulus has been the sharp drop in the value of the yen. That, in turn, has quickly pumped up profits for multinationals, mainly by raising the value of their overseas earnings when they booked them back home in yen terms. Those higher paper profits have been a big factor behind the stock market surge. But that does not on its own offer the basis for a sustainable, self-reinforcing economic recovery. To use the two main images often invoked by Kuroda, there needs to be some sign that the deflationary mindset, a psychology that has bred caution and risk aversion, has been broken, not just among stock investors, but corporate executives and consumers. There needs to be some sign that companies and consumers are changing their behavior in a way that supports each other, to put in place what Kuroda calls the virtuous cycle, a self-sustaining cycle of spending and investment for growth. And while there have been some signs of progress, so far they've not been conclusive as to whether we've reached those turning points or not. Companies are still sitting on a large chunk of those record profits in the form of retained earnings. They remain fairly cautious in capital spending and cautious on raising wages. The caution is a legacy of the deflationary era, one that has remained amazingly persistent, when executives felt so uncertain about Japan's longer-term prospects, it seemed the most prudent path was to hoard whatever cash they gained in anticipation of the next downturn just around the corner, rather than to spend it on new equipment or on workers to take advantage of and to commit to a next wave of growth. A separate sign of an economy that may not be so responsive to stimulus has been the disappointing performance of exports. That's been one of the big and unexpected negative factors holding back Abenomics over the past 2 years, the fact that exports have barely risen despite the sharp drop in the value of the yen. Some economists say that may be the result of a fundamental shift in Japan's industrial structure, where companies moved so much production offshore during the deflationary era, they're simply less inclined now to produce in and export from Japan. Of course, Abenomics isn't supposed to be just about the central bank. Recall that monetary policy is just one of the 3 arrows that Mr. Abe is supposedly firing, along with the second arrow of fiscal policy and the third arrow of structural reform. It's the third arrow that's really supposed to be the driver of Japan's return to prosperity. And I'd be eager in the question and answer session to hear what you all think about the third arrow. I would have to say that to me it has been and remains a perplexingly modest and weak effort, despite all the rhetoric that's been surrounding it. Mr. Abe has released 2 versions of his structural reform plan already and is expected to put forth another one later this month. But despite those rewrites and new drafts, all evidence suggests that the focus and logic has been and will remain unclear, a laundry list of ideals with no clear priorities, proposals that even if fully carried out would represent only small change around the edges of the status quo. As one example of that, I'd flag the labor market reforms that are currently before the Diet. Now, what I hear from people like you all the time is that if Japan is really serious about boosting its growth prospects, one extremely important change would be injecting more flexibility into the labor market. But the current debate in Parliament centers around a small-bore measure called the white-collar exemption that creates a little bit more flexibility on pay for a very small number of employees. To be fair, I would say that there are 2 potentially significant areas of structural change underway. One, as you heard from Dan at the embassy, is agriculture and trade. That starts in the form of a bill that's right now under consideration in the Diet that would curb the powers of Japan agriculture, or Nokyo. That itself is not a big deal on its own, but it is part of a broader package to have Japan join the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And if that happens, I think that would have the potential for some fairly significant and far-reaching change. But as Dan said, it's unclear at this point whether TPP will really become a reality, and whether it does or not is really at this moment largely out of Japan's control. It's more in the hands of the unpredictable mess that's the U.S. Congress. The other arguably significant change, which I know is near and dear to the hearts of many people at the ACCJ, is corporate governance. Some of those reform measures took effect just yesterday. Now, I do believe those who say that the change in rules underway have the potential to alter significantly Japanese corporate behavior, particularly to make executives more investor-friendly, to try and raise the return on equity, to be less inclined to just sit on their earnings. And we're seeing some of that already with rising dividends and share buybacks, which are, by some measures, hitting records. Now, those have helped fuel the Nikkei's robust performance, and they may, as they gain traction, help the market even further. But getting back to the main theme of what I wanted to talk about today, it's less clear to me how that feeds into improving the real economy, how those reforms are actually going to get companies to spend more on capital expenditures or on higher wages for their workers. Anyway, that's all the pessimist case. The optimists say the market is, in fact, forecasting upcoming economic trends. The optimists say the weak data has been the result of natural time lags between policy and market shifts and turning points in economic performance, lags that have been extended a bit by bad luck, like bad weather or weak economic performances overseas. The optimists say it's just a matter of months until we see the deflationary mindset conclusively lifting and the virtuous cycle finally kicking into high gear. That's the view from Mr. Kuroda and the Bank of Japan, and that's why they've held off on any additional stimulus, despite a string of disappointing price, wage, and consumption data. Barring some unforeseen disaster, this optimism means the Bank of Japan is now all but certainly on hold, at least through October or November, even if inflation does turn negative. And I should say the optimist argument got a bit of a lift yesterday from new capital spending data, which came in much stronger than expected. The economists we surveyed after the MOF survey came out said that this means that when the government next Monday, on June 8th, issues a new estimate of gross domestic product for the first quarter, it will conclude the economy grew at a pretty healthy 3% annual rate. That's higher than the original estimate of 2.4%, considerably better than the disappointing 1% for the fourth quarter and the 2 quarters of contraction that preceded it. I should also note it's considerably better than the 0.7% contraction for the same first quarter in the U.S. that was reported last Friday and the weak growth in Europe. And I should also note that the other big news from yesterday was that the Nikkei kept its winning streak alive, extending its gains to a 12th straight day. If any of you followed it with any closeness, it was a rather dramatic performance. Stocks were in negative territory for most of the day yesterday, and then turned positive for the first time about 40 minutes before the closing bell. And after seesawing back and forth, they ended up. It was just a tiny gain, 6 points, or 0.03%, but maybe it was symbolically significant that the economy and the market may finally be getting into sync. So thank you very much for listening. With that, I'd be happy to get your input and questions on where you see all this going.
Thank you. Thank you, Jacob. Let me start to add on a little bit. It's agree with the third arrow is somewhat very mild in some phase, but you said the corporate governance is the one of the points the Abe has succeeded. But I'll be add on two more. One is it's like empowerment for female workforce or empowerment for female, and then second one is the visitors, inbound visitors. That is the over 13 million in 2013 to 2014. That's quite the good number, positive number for our Japanese economy. But anyway, so for the floor, everybody has some questions or comments?
Actually, those are good points, and I should have mentioned those as well. I guess what I would say is, I mean, those certainly are two very significant developments in the economy. The number of tourists is rising, and you know, we all see it just anecdotally around town. And the rise of the women in the workforce has been significant. What I don't know is whether those are really the result of any reforms other than for the visitors, the weaker yen. There's a lot of market-driven forces as to why that's happening. In terms of the reforms about women in the workforce, and people here may feel otherwise, again, there's been a lot of talk about empowering women and promoting them. I'm not sure how much we've seen in that. And in fact, you know, if you look at where, you know, the Prime Minister and his people have control, which might be over, say, LDP candidates running for office or top executives, there hasn't been a lot of progress. And the vast majority of women who've entered the workforce continue to be sort of the lower paid part-time jobs. So.
Any questions, comments? Marima-san?
Sorry, I was not prepared, but I was just from out of the blue that I was pointed out. But I agree with you that the reform plan of the Abe cabinet is the labor market and agricultural market and corporate governance. And in my opinion, I agree with you that in line with that, what you said, that the corporate governance and stewardship code, and that's the very sort of like a good area, making some progress or sizable progress. And also that the JA reform, agricultural reform, is, of course, it's not perfect, but it's kind of encouraged by TPP type of the negotiation. I think that TPP is providing a very good momentum to push that things forward in domestically. So that's the agriculture one. But I think that the problem is, as you said, that the labor market reform is very slow. Then what is necessary? What kind of element is necessary to move the things forward in labor market reform?
I can give you some of my perspective, but I'd be eager to get other people's as well. But I think, it's a hard question because ultimately what people would say is you have to be able to fire people. And the problem, of course, is that has its own negative impact on consumer psychology. What Kuroda says, and it's interesting both on the labor market and in general, is that while it's not the Bank of Japan's job or within its powers to create structural reforms, what they can do is create an environment that's conducive to them. I think their view is that when you have a 3.3% unemployment rate, that's about as good as it's going to get, and you create a condition where people are less worried that if they lose their job, that there won't be another job waiting for them. But that doesn't necessarily mean that people are going to feel comfortable about that. And so, I should say, while I think that the reforms have been modest, I think it's hard to criticize Japan because a lot of this is embedded in what is a sort of Japanese commercial and corporate culture. And I think, it's hard to shake that up without having its own reverberations and repercussions. So, I mean, I would say if you were being honest, you would say the right to hire and fire people much more freely. But whether you get there in any form, I think, is a difficult question.
Very tight labor market. The unemployment is very low. Don't you think that this is a very sort of like a favorable situation to push the labor market reform through? Because that if the unemployment rate is very high and the people's are very sort of like uncertain feeling, it's very difficult to push through those labor market reform. However, with the current situation of the labor condition, that I think that governments can take advantage of the current situation. Don't you think?
Right. I think that's the theory, and I think you're certainly right that trying to push labor market reform when unemployment is 3.3% is easier than when it's 5.3%. But I think there's a mystery also in Japan's labor market, and I should say this isn't just for Japan, but globally, which is even with fairly tight labor markets by the standards of any given country, there's still a lot of nervousness, and there has not been a lot of wage growth. I should point out that the weak wage growth in Japan, even with 3.3% unemployment, matches a pattern that we're seeing in the United States and that we're seeing in Great Britain, which for them historically also have low unemployment rates, but still are seeing just close to flat wages. And I think until people don't only see that there's a job, but see that these jobs are providing gains, there's still a lot of anxiety over the labor market. So.
Thank you very much for that. Very enlightening. Thank you for that question too. I think what you said, everything I agree, is a great snapshot of where we are here in Japan. I was wondering if you had any comments on a little bit more deeper. I'm concerned about more deeper, also rooted issues that we have of the rapidly aging population, and also, people only tend to see Tokyo, but there's a lot of decrease in the economy outside of Tokyo. And maybe you might want to comment on how that compares with the United States as well too.
Yeah.
So some comments on what you think about those issues.
So right, I mean the aging population is obviously a serious issue and one that is getting a lot of attention in Japan. I actually think that, and the conventional wisdom is that this is sort of Japan's doom and gloom, and that if Japan somehow can't figure out a way to suddenly make women have a lot more babies or open the doors to immigration, then it's going to sort of sink into the sea. I think the reality is we don't really know. I've been spending some time studying this issue. I haven't had a chance to write about it yet. But I think the more I've looked at it, the more I think we don't really know how aging societies work. Japan really is at the forefront, and that a lot of sort of demographic and economic assumptions are straight line extrapolations of old behavior that haven't been tested. Sort of the obverse of that, I mean, you may all remember Paul Ehrlich and the Club for Rome and the sort of the 60s and 70s predictions of the dire gloom because of an overpopulation problem. And very interestingly, the New York Times did a feature on him. They have a new series that looks back at old issues. And he was still unapologetic in saying that his predictions would still come true. But I think what we may find is that the obverse becomes true, that just as 30 or 40 years ago people were predicting doom from overpopulation, that the predictions of doom from excessive aging and underpopulation may also become false, partly because there's time. I mean, you don't depopulate overnight, and economies adjust. And I think one of the interesting things about the way Japan is adjusting is, you're having a rapid increase of employment, not just by women, but by elderly people. And it's not just exploitive. I think there are a lot of people who want to work. And, one of the underappreciated facts is that particularly in Japan, people are living longer and much healthier than they were. I think it's a challenge to figure out how to take advantage of their skills in ways that make them fulfilled and benefit from the economy. And a lot of the systems are currently exploitive. But I think what we may find is that there's as much a sort of an adaptation, and Japan may in fact become a model of how to sort of deal with an aging population as much as just sort of wringing our hands and saying that's sort of the decline of Japan. Just one example, I think, of the contradictory views on this, which I hadn't thought of before until yesterday when I was talking to somebody, was the former Bank of Japan governor, Shirakawa, blamed Japan's deflation on demographics, on an aging population. That was sort of one of his main arguments for why Bank of Japan was powerless. On the other hand, when you think about it, what an aging population does if you're shrinking your workforce is create a labor shortage. And if anything, a labor shortage ought to be pushing up wages, which should be inflationary. And I think that's just one example of how we don't really understand how those dynamics work. To your point about the rural areas, I mean, I think that's also a fascinating dynamic to watch, that I think what people don't fully understand when they look at Japan's weak economy and its sort of shrinking population is that Tokyo is growing. I mean, Tokyo remains one of the fastest. I mean, I saw some statistic the other day that said Tokyo is the world's largest city now and will be in 2040. I mean, that despite the shrinking elsewhere, Tokyo is growing and its population remains fairly young. You know, what do you do with those other cities is a good question. You know, some of it has to do with not necessarily focusing on you know, the population that had been there before, but creative strategies for bringing people back. And there's actually a whole new body of literature about luring in people who want a different lifestyle. And Anna Feifel of the Washington Post actually had a very interesting story the other day about a town in Shikoku that has actually started drawing people in who realize that you can live cheaper and have more space and sort of live a more relaxed life, especially telecommuting, you know, from other parts of Japan. If that becomes the salvation of rural Japan, I don't know. But again, I think there's more dynamism than maybe is fully appreciated.
Byron Siegel with Baxalta. We used to be Baxter. They split us up. But we're in healthcare. And I was at a conference yesterday and about this aging demographic. I saw some interesting statistics that the most rapidly aging parts of Japan are the major urban areas. You know, the image is it's going to be Aomori and that. They're already old. Yeah, and so what's happening is it's the young people who are leaving. And Tokyo, Osaka, Fukuoka are actually increasing the 75 and older at a faster rate than anywhere else in Japan, which surprised me.
That is interesting.
A couple things. One on Abe's intentions. I always look at politicians and say, you know, where are they going to, you know, spend their political capital? And Koizumi, clearly it was postal reform. I haven't seen Abe do anything on the economic front where he's actually put his, you know, his prime ministership on the line. The JA stuff, I agree with you. I think it grabs a headline, but I'm not sure it's going to have much impact. Do you see, and the people I hear from, I don't think he seems to have his heart in economics. I'd like to get your views on that. And then on healthcare, to me, that's one of the areas where I think Japan has some competitive advantage or comparative advantage. You look at Yamanaka, you look at regenerative medicine, you look at this Ahmed group that's, they used to call it the Japan version of the National Institutes of Health, to pull funding and set priorities. Now, I was just wondering, I think that's an area, in healthcare, we looked at Japanese companies, there's a lot of innovation going on in these companies, and the problem is they can't commercialize it, and they're actually getting smaller in global ranking. If you look at Takeda, they're dropping. Yeah, so I'd just like to get your views on healthcare as well. Thank you.
You know, thank you. Those are all excellent points. Actually, to your first one on the urban aging, it is interesting, and I think it's true for a couple of reasons. One is I was just looking at some data on this the other day that you know, what you had in the past was older people who stayed out in the countryside and maybe tried to put pressure on their kids to come back with mixed success. But I think now you have a lot of older people who are moving to Tokyo or its, you know, surrounding suburbs to be closer to their kids and grandkids, and that's actually been a fairly significant and a somewhat surprising trend. I think also, and again, this maybe gets to one of the places where you can start to look at Japan as a model for aging societies and not just a sort of basket case, which is that in some ways, when you think about it, cities are logical places for older people to congregate, that the concentration of population provides for a concentration of infrastructure and resources that allows people to live in their homes, and there's enough critical mass to have what's close by, you know, without having to spend a whole lot of money. And so I think that may be part of what's going on as well, and it'll be interesting to see how that unfolds. I agree with you completely about Abe and his political capital and economics, and I think the contrast with Koizumi couldn't be greater, which is, you know, again, if you look at Koizumi's economic reform, you may have agreed or disagreed with it, but it was clear what it was. You could put it on a bumper sticker. He ran a campaign around it. He pushed it through, you know, Parliament. Whereas Abe, I think what's frustrating to a lot of people is, you know, the third arrow is this sort of long white paper. But if you were if you actually even talk to people at the Kante and ask them, you know, so name me the 2 or 3 most important priorities, you talk to 3 people, you'll get 3 different answers, and any one of them could be good priorities, but unless they're made a priority, nothing's going to happen. I mean, even taking what you were saying on labor reform, I mean, if they said, look, the single biggest thing we have to do is shake up the labor market, and we're going to invest in that, and we know it's going to be painful, but here's why it's going to be better for everybody, they could probably get that through and it might make a difference, but they don't choose to want to have that debate. Obviously what we're seeing right now, and I don't mean to say that this is a wrong choice, but clearly the Prime Minister is investing a fair amount of political capital in the bills on security, collective self-defense that are going through the Diet right now, and obviously he considers that to be a priority as well, and the U.S. does as well, and so, he's certainly investing his political capital in that. I think that, if and when TPP gets concluded, I think it's reasonable to assume he'll invest a fair amount of political capital in that, and that actually, I think he has been fairly brave on early on, and I think the stall at this point has been, less on his shoulders than in the U.S. The healthcare, I'm not an expert on. In fact, I'd be curious to hear more, what you say. But clearly, Japan, and what I hear from other people from pharmaceutical companies, is a great, laboratory for a lot of experimentation in health and in the health market, and that the regulations have gotten much better and more encouraging. But as you say, there's still a lot of constraints that have hampered Japanese companies. But maybe that's sort of more opportunities for foreign companies to do business here. So.
Thank you. So we do a IT services business, and we do a lot of importation of products from abroad, and the exchange rate has been really something the last 6 months. It was interesting. A Japanese banker friend of mine predicted that it would go to this level, but I'm just curious, where do you see it going from now? Just from your previous comments, it seems like it might. Actually, I have no idea. I'll leave it to you.
Foreign exchange markets are even harder to predict than the stock market. So I'm just glad I don't make my money or lose my money on that. But I guess I'd say, if you believe that they're rooted in fundamentals, that the main fundamentals that seem to have driven foreign exchange over the last, really actually even since Abenomics came in, was monetary policy and the divergence in monetary policy, and it does track that fairly closely. When the Bank of Japan if you look going back to the Lehman crisis, so it was about 120 yen to the dollar in 2007, 2008, roughly. And then the Lehman crisis happened, and central banks around the world injected massive stimulus, and the Bank of Japan was very grudging in that regard. And you can track what happened with the yen going from 120 to 75 or 80 almost completely on that disparity. And you can understand why people started hammering the Bank of Japan, who felt that the strong yen was really killing Japanese business. Even before Abe was elected, the minute he just started saying, I'm going to inject more stimulus and bring in a new Bank of Japan chair who's going to have a very different policy, the yen took off and started falling. And a lot of the movement, most of the initial leg of movement happened before Kuroda even injected his QQE. And then it was fairly stable until the second round of QQE last October. I think a lot of what's driving exchange rates right now really has to do with what's happening in the U.S. and the Federal Reserve. And, there's been this kind of on-again, off-again dance about, whether the Federal Reserve will start raising rates and when. And I think, in periods when people assume that the Fed is going to raise rates fairly soon, that's dollar strengthening and yen weakening. In periods when they're not so sure, then the dollar tends to weaken. And I think that's more than anything driving what people are looking at right now. I think at the Fed, it's hard to know how much of the assumption of a Fed increase is priced into the market right now. My guess is, an assumption it'll happen this year, but not a definitive one. And so if and when the Fed does go forward, my guess is you'll see another leg of yen weakening. The other X factor right now is probably Greece and Europe, and the extent to which, if there's a so-called Grexit and that causes chaos, first of all, what does that do to the euro, and does that create euro weakness? And secondly, one of the interesting questions that also often drove the yen over the last couple of decades or decade or so was the yen as a safe haven, that, in times of crisis, people would go buy the yen. And as we all saw, one of the remarkable moments of that was after the Japanese earthquake, which, after all, was probably one of the single biggest threats to Japan as an economy and a country in years, and yet the yen was still a safe haven for investors at that moment of crisis. So, if Europe explodes in some terrible way, does the yen still have its safe haven status, or have they done enough to now sort of chase that away? So I couldn't put a figure on the yen. I guess the other interesting counterpoint I would say about the yen driving it right now is that as you all know, there's much more ambivalence now about the value of a weaker yen than there was before. I think when Abe and Kuroda first came in, there was an assumption clearly that the yen was way too strong and that Japan needed to weaken the yen and that more weakness was better. Just the more weakness, the better. Now there's a huge amount of ambivalence toward that, and I think that's also part of what's tying the Bank of Japan's hands as well, which is a feeling that, I think if the Bank of Japan did weaken more, you would almost certainly see a fairly significant sort of another down run in the yen, but that would cause a lot more political blowback than the previous ones had done. So.
Since we're hogging the microphone on this side of the table, I'd like to ask a regional political question that I think very much impacts the long-term viability, strength of the Japanese economy. For those of you who saw Abe's speech before Congress, you may realize that during the course of that speech, Abe recognized Larry Snowden, who's the former president of the ACCJ, and to a great ovation from Congress, recognized Larry's role in building what I consider as a new model for a reconciliation over war deaths and how to honor the war dead. Larry, you may know, was an officer on Iwo Jima, built up over the last decade or so the Iwo Jima Memorial project, which has Japanese and Americans going together to jointly honor the war dead. I wonder if you think this model has any legs in terms of being something that other countries could adopt, and could this essentially change the current controversies that always arise when anyone visits Yasukuni and the like?
That's a great question. When you say other countries, I assume you mean Korea and China, basically. It's a hard question. I mean, the blood is, the tensions are much greater, and the animosity, I think, the lingering animosity, much greater than they were between the U.S. and Japan in the post-war era, and obviously the dynamics are very different. I think it's hard to know. I mean, Abe clearly has, I think, aggravated the situation, and both with his comments and what he hasn't said, and with his visits to Yasukuni, and I think there's more he could do. But it's worth remembering, particularly with Korea, that the tensions were not, the relations were not great before Abe came in, that there were a lot of issues that were bubbling to the surface that were driven, among other things, by Korean domestic politics and other tensions that exist. I thought that Peter Tasker, many of you I'm sure know, had a good column in the Nikkei a couple weeks ago where I thought it captured it really well, where he said something to the effect that the reason that there is tension over history between these countries has to do with conflicting interests today. It's not that they're in conflict today because of the tensions over the history. And so particularly I think for China, it's interesting to watch where I think they use the history as a convenient issue which they turn on and off. And so, or as somebody else put it, I mean, Japan could probably do a lot more to be like Germany. Often people make the analogy between Japan and Germany. But as I think maybe it was someone wrote in an op-ed piece in our paper, if Japan behaves like Germany, will Korea and China behave like France? And we don't know the answer to that. And so it's an unfortunate cycle of aggravation that I think is going to be a lot harder to solve than the U.S.-Japan tensions and Iwo Jima. I mean, I think something like that would be a great start and maybe would be a step forward, but I think there's a lot more that needs to happen, maybe generationally, for them to really get past that in a constructive way.
Well, thank you. I know we are running out of time, but I have one last question. Sorry, you clearly pointed out the second arrow is the fiscal easing policies, and also third arrow for pointing out some of the questions and comments. But how about the first one, fiscal discipline?
Well, that's an important one, and one that's actually going to get a lot more attention this month, because the government has to release, I think by the end of June, their midterm fiscal plan. And that's, an area of increasing tension where I think that the Abe administration, they're committed to trying to reach balanced budget by 2020. But I think having been burned, feeling like they've been burned with the last tax increase, they're very hesitant to do another one. I think there is an argument that Japan, in some ways, was too focused on fiscal discipline, and that the primary order of business is to just break free of deflation and use all of your policy tools to get the so-called escape velocity, and that the mistake was trying to rein in the fiscal policy too soon last year. And that's, I think, it sounds like what the Abe administration will try and do is claim that they're going to reach balance with very optimistic economic assumptions. And there was a story just in this morning's Nikkei where the finance ministry is already trying to fight back against that and say, you can't just assume 3% growth and therefore wave a magic wand and your problems go away. So I think that has been in the background, but I think will come forward fairly soon as one of the more important debates, in addition, in fact, more so probably than the regulatory reforms.
Thank you.